Welcome to Unleashed. I'm your host, Will Bachman. Earlier in October, I had an amazing opportunity to travel around Europe, meeting up in person with independent management consultants in 5 different cities. When I conceived of the trip, I had assumed that I would just fly from one city to another, but when I sat down to actually book all the travel, I realized I'd be able to get around Europe completely by train. And so I ended up taking the train from London to Amsterdam, and then to Paris, and then to Munich, and then to Zurich. These train rides were in one way the highlight of the whole trip, and I thought I'd share some observations here in the show on how to travel around Europe by train, but perhaps more importantly, why to take the train. So first I want to talk about why, and then I'll share 5 reasons to consider taking the train, and then we'll talk about some tips on how to do it. So for my European friends, you may skip this episode because it might be second nature, but to folks who haven't taken the train in Europe before, this is for you. So number 1, time. In terms of time, the train is often faster than a flight, particularly in Europe, if you look at the door-to-door time it takes. Because the train stations in Europe are generally right in the city center, so you're probably close to where you're starting from and close to your destination. So let's say that you have a 3-hour train ride, and maybe that translates into a 30-minute flight in terms of actual flight time. If you take the train, then maybe you walk to the train station, or you take a taxi or an Uber for, let's say, 10 euros, and maybe it takes you 10 minutes to get to the train station. So you get there 15 minutes, let's say, before your train departs, and if your train departs on time. So 3 hours later, you arrive at the train station right in the center of town where you're going, and from there it takes you 10 minutes to get to your final destination. So your total travel time was 3 hours and 35 minutes. If you decide to fly, on the other hand, you take a cab to the airport, and there's traffic, of course, so it takes you 45 minutes to get to the airport. And you arrive an hour before your flight and have to endure the hassle of standing in line through check-in and security, and your flight's delayed by an hour. So finally board, you sit on the tarmac for 30 minutes, you have a 30-minute flight, but when you arrive, your gate isn't available, so you sit in the plane for another 20 minutes, unable to get your laptop out and do any work. You finally deplane, and then you walk through the terminal, that's 10 minutes, and then you stand in line for a taxi, 10 minutes, and then it takes 30 minutes to get to the center of town. So if I've done the math right, that's 275 minutes, or 4 hours and 35 minutes. Now, case in point. So I left London. I left an event in London, and I took the train to Amsterdam. A Dutch colleague who was attending the same event and left at the same time was heading home to Rotterdam, which is right near Amsterdam. And I arrived Amsterdam at 10 p.m., and she texted me when she arrived home in Rotterdam. It was after midnight, so a couple hours, because she had some flight delays and so forth. So case in point. Number 2 reason would be comfort. So if you compare the experience on the train, you have this really grand seat. It's larger and more comfortable than most business class seats on any airplane. And you can have a table where you can set down your laptop, and it's not a little miniature table for leprechauns, but it's actually a real table. And on the flight, or on the other hand, let's say that whole 4.5 hour transit time that we talked about, it's all broken up into little pieces, and you're standing in line, you're shuffling around, you're waiting in line at the airport, you're sitting waiting to board your flight, and when you actually get up in the air, you have to keep your laptop stowed during takeoff and landing, so you don't have any real extended time to actually get your work done. So the train is simply a far more civilized way to travel. Number 3, culture. On the train, you'll find many fewer foreign tourists. It's mostly local residents. And you feel like you're actually participating in a way of getting around that people have been doing in Europe for 150 years. And you step into what feels like just a distinctive European experience, as opposed to the homogenized and internationalized experience of air travel, where every air terminal pretty much looks kind of the same, and you're doing the same, going through security and so forth. Plus, many of the stations are just simply breathtaking. They're really the cathedrals of our age. The ceilings are multiple stories high, the buildings are several blocks wide, trains are arriving and departing, and they're just one of my favorite places in any city. Number 4 reason would be the view. So you have these amazing views scrolling by that you can't usually get by driving because you're just cutting right across the landscape. So you actually get to see a lot of Europe, and mostly it's full of fields. There's a lot of farming going on in Europe. In the US, cities blur into the suburbs and then suburbs into exurbs, particularly if you're driving. It takes a long time after leaving New York City to come to a respectable farm. But if you leave Paris or Munich or Amsterdam, in about 10 minutes you're out in the farmland, and it's really beautiful. Number 5, and most important reason for me, is reverie. So somehow, for me at least, the reverie that the scenery induces, that being able to just passively observe the landscape while it's going by, while you also have a keyboard at the ready or an open notepad, it's just such a fertile environment for coming up with new ideas. You probably aren't being interrupted with phone calls because you're not really supposed to do phone calls in the train car, and you've got something to observe out the window. You're looking at small towns, farmhouses, utility lines, fields, cows, lots of cows, and you got the rhythmic hum of the rails and the sensation of motion, and it's just enough to keep your monkey mind occupied while you get some real deep thinking done. And every so often, bam, you get an amazing idea. So only in the shower do I get so many useful ideas as on the train, and in the shower it's much harder to write the ideas down right away. So for the idea generation alone, the train trip is totally worth it. It's a great time for goal setting. You can stop and you can think about what you want to do in life, what are you trying to achieve across your personal life, family life, work life. You can reflect on questions to gain greater self-knowledge, such as these 3 questions, which are suggested by the School of Life. What am I anxious about? What am I upset about? What am I excited about? Or you could just work on your to-do list, what you want to accomplish, or maybe just muse over a particular problem at work. So that's reason number 5. One downside I will mention is that taking the train actually costs more than flying in a lot of cases. It's somewhat of a bummer and a little bit counterintuitive. You'd think that it would take a lot more energy to lift a plane and to get you and your luggage off the ground than to pull you along on a train, but somehow, and you think that a train ought to be cheaper, but it's not necessarily the case. It is more civilized. My train rides were around $150 or so each, and often flights were available thanks to EasyJet and these super low-cost airlines in Europe. Often you could get around for $80 from one city to another, but then that doesn't include the cost of the taxi to get you to and from the airport. So now let's talk a little bit about the how. We talked about the why. Maybe you're convinced by this point that it's a good idea to take the train. So some tips. Number 1, definitely buy your tickets in advance online. You really don't want to just show up at the train station and try to stand in line and buy your tickets right before the departure. The train very well might be sold out, and that would be a total bummer. It was a little confusing to me on how to buy the train tickets online, and I'm still definitely not an expert at it. There's like multiple sites that sell the tickets, and you can buy them direct from the individual train authority, train company that's running that particular train. Some of the websites that I found are more user-friendly than others. The site that I found that I like the best is trainline.eu, and I'll include that link in the show notes. Trainline, one word, .eu. The interface was pretty straightforward, and it worked without any hiccups. On another site that I tried before trainline.eu, which was raileurope.com, which seems to have slightly better search engine marketing, I had a little trouble getting through the purchase process. It kind of hiccuped with my credit card, and it's just a little bit of more of a hassle to register. I finally did get through after 3 attempts, and then I realized that I paid a higher price on that site than I needed to. So I like trainline.eu. And again, you can Google for advice on this. Rick Steves has some advice on how to buy train tickets, but that's what I did. Tip number 2, print your tickets at home or before you get to the train station. I didn't test if it's possible to show the ticket just on your phone. It seems to be the case. However, just to be safe, it's nice to have a paper ticket, print your ticket at home. You're going to have to show your ticket at once or twice or 3 times, depending on the station. In Amsterdam, I had to scan the ticket just to get into the railway station. So I think you could do it on your phone, but then if your phone is like low on juice or you have trouble downloading your ticket, just nice to have the paper copy. At Paris, I had to scan my ticket to get onto the platform of my train, whereas in Munich, I was able to walk into the station, walk all the way up to the train, get on the train. I only had to show the ticket when the conductor came by. Tip number 3, check how early you need to arrive at the station before your train departs. So in London, fortunately, I researched it and I read online you're supposed to arrive at the station 45 minutes before your train departs, and this was for that international train through the Channel, the Eurostar to Amsterdam. Now, for just a normal train within the UK, this doesn't apply, but to that international train to Paris or Amsterdam or Brussels, you want to get there 45 minutes ahead of time. I'm glad I listened to that advice. When I took the train, I had to go through passport control, and you have to send your luggage through a scanner. So they don't make you take your shoes off or take your laptop bag out, but it did take time just staying in line. And I kind of got to the station, just with about 5 minutes to spare. At the other stations, I could have arrived just 10 minutes before the train left, and I would have been okay. At Amsterdam, Paris, and Munich, you just go right up to the platform, you get on the train, and there's no passport control, no security checks. Even if you're going internationally within Europe, you may have to scan your ticket to get onto the platform, but other than that, there's no security control. But you do want to give yourself a few minutes at the station because they can be crowded, so people in your way, and they can be large, a couple city blocks wide, and you may need to walk all the way to the end of the train to get to your assigned seat. So it could be a 10-minute walk once you get to the station to get to your seat. So give yourself a few minutes at the station. So now tip number 4, at least in my sample set of these 4 train rides, in every case I had an assigned seat, which I didn't choose. The trainline.eu just printed it out with the assigned seat. The printed ticket will have your train car number and your seat number within that car. So if you're kind of a newbie like me, you don't just get on in any of the train cars, but find the train car number that is yours. And you can usually start boarding 10 to 15 minutes ahead of time, ahead of the departure time, if you are at the kind of first stop on the trip, if you're at the first terminal station. So it's fine to show up a little bit early and settle in. Tip number 5, most of the trains will have a luggage rack for your larger luggage, usually sort of right when you get on the train. There'll be a little section there where you can stow your luggage. So it's nice not having to check your bags and then wait for baggage claim. And so on 3 of those trains I took, there was a luggage rack. On the Munich to Zurich train, there was not. So it would have been a little awkward putting my big kind of checked bag type bag in the overhead there. But fortunately, it was not a very full train, so I was able to commandeer an extra seat and just put it in that seat. Tip number 6, railway stations do have coffee and plenty of food options usually, not surprising. And all the railway stations I visited had great coffee options, pastry options, so you'd be able to get something to eat. 3 of them had a Starbucks, that key marker of civilization, and not much in terms of fine dining, but generally some options for pastry, sandwiches, and other portable food. Also, as you'd expect, all the train stations have bookstores, usually with a decent sized section of books in English, and newspapers from across Europe. Tip number 7, do not rely on having Wi-Fi or even any kind of good connectivity while on your train ride. So I had been planning that I'd get a ton of work done doing various stuff online on these trips, assuming that the train would either have Wi-Fi or I could use my phone's personal hotspot. However, the Wi-Fi on the Eurostar train from London to Amsterdam was completely worthless. It said that it had Wi-Fi, and there was a Wi-Fi signal, and you could connect to it, but there was no connection to the internet, or at least very, 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 very intermittent. The train, I guess, was moving too fast to connect to the Wi-Fi, to connect to the land, and it was too fast for my cell phone to get coverage. I mean, we're going at 200 to 300 kilometers per hour. I guess, I don't know, my cell phone couldn't keep up with that. So, lesson learned, if you plan to work, download stuff and plan to work offline. So, that's it. I would love your thoughts if you traveled in Europe, taking the train. Love to hear about it. And any other questions you have, I'd love it if you'd send me a question. I'll answer it on the show. You can email me at unleashed@umbrex.com. And you can also visit umbrex.com/unleashed, sign up for our weekly email, and then you'll get the transcript of every episode, plus some consulting tips, plus some recommended reading. And I would love to hear from you. And if this episode's been helpful, hope you'll share it with one or two people. Thanks for listening.